Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Adventures in DevOps. You would think after a few hundred episodes I would learn the name of the show, but I'm working on it.
I think it's actually getting worse, Will.
It is, because now I've got like this mental block, where my internal monologue is going, don't F it up, don't F it up. Wait, watch, he's going to F it up.
This is the second week in a row. I think that he effed it up.
Cool. Welcome, Warren. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I actually do have a fact this week. It's not security related. I actually am a little worried that we may have reached a plateau, local maximum for our innovation in AI, because we've already started to see products that are heavily toward exploitation, and so you can see that there's been a huge shift in where we were before, things being released for free, and now we're at this stage of the technology where everyone's just trying to extract value from it. I don't know what that means for the long term, but I think it's really interesting.
I think it means shareholder profits. That's
Well,
my
let's
vote.
hope, right? That's what everyone says. Everyone wants shareholder profits, and maybe we're actually getting there.
Maybe. So, speaking of AI, our guest this week, John W. Maley, attorney at large, founded the consulting firm John Maley and Associates. But before you jump off the deep end and go, what in tarnation? We'll lawyer it up for this episode. It's actually relevant because in addition to being an attorney, John has his master's degree in computer science from Stanford University. And the thing that led me to having this conversation with him, he's the author of the book Juris Ex Machina. It's a sci-fi book, but it's about where the US has replaced jurors in the legal system with AI. And, there may be some fallout with that. And so that's the topic of the book. And we're going to talk about all kinds of things, AI, engineering, and sci-fi related. So, John, thank you for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. Great to be a guest.
Right on. I'm looking forward to this. I was just looking at your bio here, and it cracks me up. You have running, swimming, long distance motorcycling, classic car restoration, stage diving, crowd surfing, bar fighting, llama rancher. Like we could go on and on this episode for quite a while because it's a little embarrassing, like how much of my background overlaps with yours.
The llama ranching.
I can't claim llama ranching, but there's a lot of other stuff on there.
I've tried to live my life such that it would be a rich source of blackmail sources. So.
Nice, nice. So that legal background is going to pay off for you in the future, right?
Well, and once you've done one thing that's blackmail worthy, then it kind of dilutes the market, right? So, like, if I go and do a bunch of other things, it's like, well, you already could have blackmailed me for this first thing, so like your leverage is pretty much the same.
Right on. So tell me a little bit about how you went from computer science to legal.
Yeah, so I was at this crossroads to a street, and the devil was there, and lots of banjo competition.
A fiddle of gold.
Pick learning to play guitar when he asked what you wanted.
You know, now you mentioned that idea. So so yeah, I originally went to college, went to Syracuse for computer engineering, and I double majored. I was studying psychology at the time too, and they were at the time more disparate fields. So you would learn interesting things in your classes, and every now and then you'd have these moments where these things would just sort of synthesize into some really cool idea that bridged the two fields. And the most obvious recurring spot for these types of things was AI, because that was kind of one of the few areas where there was overlap between those two fields. So time passed, and AI was just mostly something you read about in textbooks. And then at Stanford, when I was getting my grad degree in computer science, we actually, the rubber met the road, and we actually got to write AIs that would, for games being played against each other, different applications like that. That was really fun and exciting, but it was kind of like this shiny novelty that the only place people were really using neural nets to a great extent back then was like the post office for recognizing characters and numbers and things that were cool, it was cool that you could train something and it would get better at it, but it wasn't something that you like would tell people about at cocktail parties and they'd be like, "Oh my God, like this is going to change the world." So um, that just kind of became like that stayed interesting to me, but it was kind of dormant. And then I worked as a computer engineer on a microprocessor design and validation team for 5 or 6 years. And while that was happening, I had filed, I'd been an inventor on several patents and had worked with these different patent attorneys who worked with the company I worked for. And it occurred to me that whenever you would talk to these guys, you'd be like, you'd be sitting in your kind of sad little gray cubicle and you'd ask these guys, so, where are you based? And they'd say, well, I'm in my yacht in the Caribbean right now, or I'm in a walled compound in the Nevada desert. And you like, it got to the point where you would start asking, it was the answer was always so fascinating that you would just start asking people like the first thing you would ask. And so I realized that these guys were interesting because they were technologists and they'd gone into patent law, and so they had been able to leverage the fact that they were interested in technology, but kind of break free of, at the time when there wasn't a lot of remote work, kind of break free of that mold of being in the office 9 to 5 and kind of pursue other interests more freely on the side. So I ended up going to law school at night and learning more about law, obviously. And then at the end of that, I was doing work that had to do with CPUs and GPUs. So looking at companies' patent portfolios and helping them figure out like this is a useful invention that actually is likely to be used, and this is not a useful invention that looks great on paper but won't really work as well. And then over time, GPUs started getting bigger and bigger and bigger as time went on, as far as like how much I was asked to look at them. And part of that was because 3D graphics was taking off even more. But then eventually we got to the point where there were these GPUs that were general purpose and weren't really necessarily being used for graphics, and they were being used for server farms and cloud computing. And eventually that just sort of took over. So it was kind of cool from that standpoint that I went from, the only time I would talk about AI in a patent portfolio was like analog brake systems or lane change sensors and, luxury vehicles, to suddenly just about everything I work on now has some foot in the AI space in some way or another, whether it's hardware that helps enable it or whether it's software. So that's kind of cool because it's something that's always fascinated me, and now it's suddenly fascinating to society as well. So I'm no longer an outlier.
So where do you think AI is at on the overhype cycle? Do you think it's overhyped right now, or do you think it's
I think
appropriate?
I think it's kind of both, right? There's a lot of asymmetry. Um, I think it's overhyped in terms of every company is now rushing to get on the bandwagon and find a way to add AI to their product, even if it's just kind of pointless or doesn't work very well. Like I was reading an article yesterday about how all these dating apps had incorporated AI and they were still just as crappy and poor at finding people that match you as they were before. But now they're faster at being crappy. So
Oh, so
there's
that's a
that.
win.
I mean, I love the outcome there, which is your entire romantic life will be decided by two robots talking to each other, right? I mean, both on the receiving of the message and the sending will now uh, no longer be human, and you'll decide on whether or not to pursue a person based on what the algorithm says, right?
Well, there's a conflict of interest too, right? Because now there's AI agents that are designed that you can date. And so then, it's like monetized and that you can buy them accessories and
Do not Google that. Do not Google the accessories that are available while you're on your work computer.
so it's funny because not only is it creating this fake dating relationship, it's kind of making you the sugar daddy because the AI person is entirely dependent on you for new outfits and jewelry and things, and pets and just overall happiness. And so it's a conflict of interest that they're sort of steering you toward bad people that you're incompatible with. So it just makes dating the AIs even more appealing. fine, I give up. I will just date an AI.
We're already at the dystopian future, right? There's no next step after this. We're already there. This is where like the whole science fiction movies and television shows and books are already set, right? Where we're dating the AI.
It's true, and this is the underhype overhype like paradigm. I think that at the same time, if we call like a tech support or a customer support line and we say like speak to an operator, it takes like 25 tries of me yelling that louder and louder before the AI just like click and say, "Oh, that's what you want." So other areas like there's a total lack of AI development, and by the same token, we have this old fear that we got, I think, from science fiction through the 70s and 80s and onward, that AI was going to become this thing that once it got sufficiently intelligent, it would just sort of take over and start annihilating humans or imprisoning them so they don't hurt themselves or anywhere in between. And what we actually have is a gazillion different AIs that all have very different specializations and very different motivations of what they're trying to optimize. And there's no sort of universal intelligence generalized AI yet where it just goes out and tries to help humanity. It's more like, I'm really good at um, analyzing research results or counting how many times a word appears on a form or something like that. So it's accelerating things, but it's still very specialized and it's not multimodal to any great extent yet. And it's really easy to flag uh, a, a sort of outlier AI response and turn it into all kinds of news headlines. And that's interesting because it's sort of driving concerns over this more than actual outcomes are. And in some ways, the actual outcomes are kind of what we need to be more worried about. So, I would, in a true legal answer, I would say yes and no.
I mean, I think it's really interesting that you bring up a bunch of those points. I mean, I think the decentralization of responsibilities and the specialization that the AI is taking up, is a really great point. And right now, I do feel like they are solving sort of very tail value things. Like there's no core solution. There's no core greatness that's coming out of it for society. And for sure, I don't really think anyone's talking about that. I think as far as we've gotten is we should be afraid, and that's I think as far as people are willing to go. I think what you're talking about though really requires some complex questions to be answered, and I don't think humans have been so great at figuring out even which questions to ask, let alone answering them for things that are much simpler, like what will happen tomorrow or the next day.
Right. And that's kind of what's fascinating about AI, right? Is that even the developer who put the model together may not even know what its capabilities are and what the best questions to be asking are. But it's and it is like a question of like what's the utility of this, right? And so I was thinking the other day, like I was using ChatGPT. I was using the O1 model, so the one that is slower and much more thorough and a lot more nodes. And I asked it some really stupid question because I forgot to switch into a lesser model, and I wanted to know how many calendar days were between like January 11th and some other day. And it immediately started churning and starting its like 5-minute process, and I'm like, oh, why didn't I switch? And my chief source of that was not impatience; it was like guilt at like, man, I wonder how much like cooling water I'm using and how much like energy this query is sucking down for something stupid. And so it barks out the answer of like 31 days or whatever, and then I look at the prompt again, and it's like some questions you might want to ask is a hot dog a sandwich? And I realized that they're basically promoting like even more frivolous uses of these AIs than what I just felt guilty for doing. So it's really interesting. I think in a lot of ways it parallels what we saw with like the tech bubble in '99 and 2000, where they're kind of so concerned with the future of how powerful their model is going to be that they're less concerned with short-term profitability and whether, like, for instance, like you should have a sorting algorithm that says this is a really easy question. We can farm this out to like one of the mini models. And this is a research question that, we probably want to use as many nodes as possible. So right now it seems like they charge you some tiny amount per month, and it doesn't at all probably cover all their energy expenses and the huge amounts of cooling that they need to do in all their server farms and all that.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're actually onto something because there are a bunch of companies out there that now are promoting this idea of model routing amongst many companies at the same time to try to get you some of that value. Although it like that's a non-trivial thing to even do to think about. Like, how complex
Right.
is this question actually? Is and like how good of an answer do you need? Is I find maybe almost one of those things that could be impossible to answer.
It's it's true, and and how did you mean the question? Like, if I'm going to ask what's the meaning of life, and it's just going to laugh and spit out 42, that doesn't take much in the way of cycles. If it actually is trying to give me a comprehensive philosophical and theological answer where it goes and queries all these different texts, like that's huge. So you can't even necessarily just take a question and say there's a right answer to that. But it is it is an interesting kind of paradigm of how how these models are, which model is even most appropriate. And I think the solution to that problem, maybe what you sometimes see with kind of almost like speculative execution, where it's like, here, can you do a preview of what type of answer you would come back with if I gave you the contract to go and do this research? And, the idea of having these things work collaboratively is interesting, but it also, um, it's much easier for AIs to jailbreak each other, for instance. It's they're just better at kind of pushing each other's buttons. So it really adds a lot of dynamicity into the equation of like dynamism of how what the AIs are capable of when you add these very different AIs and have them converse and
Well,
pursue common goals.
that's not something I've actually heard before. I don't know if you have more information about that, but utilizing one model from one provider to a different provider for jailbreaking. I mean, you said jailbreaking. I'm not sure exactly if there's a jailbreaking here, but like, what are you getting out there? Like, is it being able to understand and get a better answer to your query? Something else? Like, how does that work?
Well, so I mean, I guess what I would liken it to is, it like in IT, it's AI is great at coming up with automated ways to just implement something. So if I ask um, AI to write me a script that does X, and then, hey, this isn't my normal computer system. I'm not familiar with this OS. Can you also tell me how to set this up as like a recurring daemon that runs at like 4 a.m. or whatever? Like it's really surprisingly proficient at coming up with um, lists, procedural lists. It's good at writing scripts, and so the idea of using it for hacking and enumeration and not kind of automating all these different processes, kind of for you know red team or blue team is kind of impressive. But I think the you do see a lot of really interesting results when you get like you set up a chat room with a couple different AIs, and they shouldn't be the same AI. They should have very different prompting, different personalities, or they should just be completely different models. And the difference being that if I'm sitting there trying to bypass the safety protocols of an AI, I'm going to try this, I'm going to try this, I'm going to try this, and it's a very dynamic process because I have to see what it kicks back and then think of a way around it. Um, and that's a very manual process. But if you have an AI that's just constantly bombarding it with permutations, it suddenly becomes easier for it to do. And I think that is, I mean, I think the future, and this is something that's my second, but the sequel to the first book, which has not come out yet, um, has to do with is exploring what we're going to see in the future with AI, where they essentially are going to have factions and gang wars, where an AI might be tasked with spiking a competitor's AI's training. So give it some sort of weird corner case where when a certain type of input comes up, it completely malfunctions. Or it could be something like, help me bypass the safety protocols of this other AI, or help me trick this AI into doing something that's harmful to the company's interests. So I think that is going to be something we're going to see increasingly of AIs being, it's kind of like what we have with deepfakes, right? You can create a deepfake with an AI, and we're past the point now where we can necessarily reliably look at something and say, oh, that's a deepfake. And so what do you need is the stopgap against that? Well, you need an AI to tell you whether it's fake. So if you're just the average consumer, you don't know much about deepfakes or how to detect deepfakes. And meanwhile, these companies aren't super motivated to tell you how their product works because it just invites a design around for malicious actors. So you end up in this situation kind of like what we had in the 1980s and 90s with antivirus software, where the average person doesn't necessarily need to know how viruses work, but they do know that there's a handful of trusted companies that generally are, you can trust how they work even if you don't necessarily know how. So I think more and more we're going to just see AI as being the defense against AI, and there's no way around that. And we're going to keep entering into those types of situations.
You were talking about, using AIs um, to work against other AIs. As someone who is just like a practitioner of writing code and building infrastructure, like what are the considerations that I should be thinking about whenever I'm using AI or the company wants to implement some AI as a service product?
So there's a couple different, it's kind of this amorphous black box, and you have to kind of look where all the weird edges are. On one hand, you have your own privacy uh, concerns, like if I'm having this access customer data, or if I'm having it write scripts for our unique environment, do I really want to be exporting knowledge of my company's environment out into the world? And then if someone else asks about that environment, it already has optimized answers for those things. And that's the solution to that is tough, right? So Jensen Huang at NVIDIA, like his response to this is, we'll have these sovereign AIs. So every country and every big company should just buy their own AI from us, and we'll sell lots of AIs, and it will solve all the
Right?
problems. So the solution is to give us money. So that is, I mean, but that does work, right? Because you can kind of control output. And so I assume that at some point we're going to get to some sort of auditable level of privacy. Um, but then the difficulty of that is, look at how privacy works. Like when Google was, kind of more serious about doing the right thing and not doing bad stuff, they used to disassociate intentionally, like you disaggregate uh, so that you would track browser histories and build this little model of the person you were dealing with, but you would not know that person's identity, and that was intentional. So you wouldn't have it mapped to an IP address. And that was great at the time, but you have to ask yourself when it comes to privacy is like not what can be done with this information now, because maybe companies are not very efficient at exploiting information, but this same information is still going to be in the same drives, like in some tape backup or whatever from years earlier, and it can be brought out and aggregated back together by a much more powerful AI. So I think one thing we have to do is always be very future focused, kind of like with cryptography. Like if we come up with, an easier way to crack 256 bits, well, I probably should have used a higher number of bits, for instance. If we go to quantum computing, all bets are off. So that's one aspect of it. I think another is, the average the real helpful uses of AIs for implementing things and coding things. It's not something that spits out a one-page script, right? I thought that was neat because it spits out a script. I can ask it to write it in a language I'm not even familiar with, so I can help kind of teach it to myself. But if you're asking it to generate, 300 megs of code for some critical company thing, uh, there you kind of can't replace technical knowledge. Like there needs to be someone who can look through it and audit it and make sure that it's not doing something really dangerous, or it's not adding an obvious exploit that someone could use, or it's not intentionally installing some exploit because it turns out that it was written by some NGO, abroad, actually wrote this AI, and or got a backdoor into it that, if it is asked a defensive security question, it has a known mistake that it puts in. So that's the other thing. I mean, AI is like a really authoritative sounding, helpful person who works with you in a lab who also is full of crap, and like half the things they tell you are utterly fine. So it's tricky because it's got the abilities, but it doesn't really necessarily have the credibility, and it's really easy to get overly comfortable with it, uh, and get in a position where you're maybe not looking quite as closely at it as you should be. The same way that if you buy an autonomous vehicle, the first day you're driving with your hands like an inch from the steering wheel, and then a week later maybe they're back here, and then 6 months later you're just like sound asleep in the car, like having to take you home, and you've found a way to fake the hands on steering wheel sensor. So we're somewhere on that continuum, and it's a dangerous continuum, especially if once you let the genie out of the bottle, you can't really put it back if you've made some critical implementation mistake and already been exploited.
Yeah, I mean, I think you brought up a really good point here, and I feel like about sort of the defenses that are available. And I think my biggest concern isn't that we're not going to develop those counterattack strategies; it's that a majority of people aren't going to utilize them. Like for instance, I think a lot of companies that are experimenting with AI to generate code, I know, given that they believe that they're going to end up generating a lot of code, they're not doing as good of a job validating it, which means those contain significant security bugs. And the worst part is, since there's such a finite number of models out there that are generating code, you can just go to each of the models and be like, hey, give me the same code, give me an example of this, and then you can just use the same model to find out what security vulnerabilities are actually in the code that was just generated. And now you have the answer to attack any company that's used those models and didn't take those extra steps. So like, I think that's what scares me a lot, is that people are going to be utilizing the tools and technology we have available, but not realizing that they need to take it much, much further in order to protect themselves.
Absolutely, yeah, and we definitely end up, and this is something that also gets explored in the second novel, is like we're going to end up in an arms race, because what we're talking about, it used to be software would come out and like Windows 2010, and everybody knows what that is, and like then there's some major release and there's minor releases that like same with iOS. That's not really how AI models work. That they can be kind of changed out from under you, and when there are updates when there's new models, they're generally not making incremental fixes to improve the model. They're gutting it and throwing away and starting with an entirely new one that has new capabilities and everything else. So it's going to be this continuous process, right? It's like, okay, well, how do I detect that this is a deep fake? Okay, well, if I implement this, now I ask the same AI, okay, now if I wanted to get around this, how would I do it? And then it tells you, and it's like, okay, well, then how would I defend against that? And so you can let these things churn and churn and churn and churn, but eventually I think it's going to be kind of like what you saw with how supercomputing was used in the nuclear arms race, where a handful of countries get a bunch of testing done and are able to build these really sophisticated models, and then they have them on computer. And then there's these like third world countries that are like, man, we want nukes, but we don't have supercomputers. Like, how do we do the modeling for this? And um, the countries that have already have their answer, they're like, well, you're not allowed to do nuclear testing because we did it and it's bad.
Right?
It becomes this thing where you're at a huge competitive disadvantage if someone like a government or a big corporation has the cloud assets to leverage against some small company who maybe doesn't have the computing cycles to push their defense development, their automated incremental development to quite the same budget level. And that is definitely going to be kind of a societal issue that I think is going to emerge.
My gut reaction tells me most companies aren't going to pursue it to that level. Like right now, because like right now, what it feels like is there is so much funding available for throwing AI on something that there's not really an incentive to think about security or real world problems or what the long term strategy is. It seems very short focused. I feel like the same thing is true for crypto and Web3, that there's so much funding available that you don't really have to be solving a problem. You just have to say that you're using this, and all of a sudden people are writing you $1 million checks to fund it.
Yeah, and we also have this short-term interest in maximizing shareholder value,
Right?
and we end up with these there's things that we're all used to is that are seen by the bean counters as like black holes, like tech support, right? Having good support, tech support versus bad tech support. It's just this expense that they're not excited about spending money on. And when it comes to defense against hacks and things, until there's some massive exploit that takes down somebody in our same industry, that's when suddenly we get serious about it. And you see this like if you go to DEF CON and you sit in the social engineering village and you watch, them just call down the list and try to get important secrets out of corporations, inevitably there's just some company that nobody's been trained about anything, what it comes down to is just what you said. It's like expedience. It's like, okay, this guy just called from IT, he just wants me to do this quick thing on my computer. I'm busy, I'm not going to take all the time to go and verify that. And I think that's, when you have these things that are seen as like these black hole expenses that are sort of speculative in nature, it's like, well, how secure do we need to be? We don't really know. It's kind of like this moving target. Well, how many decimals do you need? 99.9999% chance of success, or is 99.9% good enough? And it turns out that the difference in spending to close that gap is massive. And yeah, it seems like something that it's, if you're doing something in an industry standard way, and the whole industry is doing a crappy job, and you match that crappy job, then no shareholders are really going to have as easy a time coming after you for like being especially lackadaisical with these issues.
From a legal perspective, like with ransomware, I know you can get like ransomware insurance, and so it's like, okay, we got hacked. Here's an insurance claim. What kind of things similar to that are you seeing coming in play for AI? Where I could have like AI insurance.
I think we're going to have this entirely new category of risk. And the risk is not just that like such and such event happens like ransomware. It's got to be kind of this broader category of like, we were stupid and we let AI grab all our information and incorporate it into its network, and we've now lost our entire competitive advantage. There's so many different things that can happen where you give away secrets, or you get victimized by a deep fake. There was a company in Europe where there was a deep fake of the guy's supplier calling like the vice president at home on a weekend and saying, "Hey, something went wrong with this last batch. We need an advance payment for this amount." And and he wired some like six-figure amount to kind of get the train back on the rails before like the end of the vacation. And then he got to work on Monday, and he's like, "Oh no." So like that wasn't this guy at all. So that's AI introduces all kinds of weird black swan things, and how you insure against those as a category is an interesting question, but I think it's one that will be helpful because it will add this kind of level of auditing that asks questions like, do all your employees have a real-time, deepfake detector for incoming company calls? So there's going to be kind of best practices that I think will emerge from there long before they emerge from, anything legislative.
I mean, I'm super pessimistic on most of those things, but there is one area, and I like the example about phishing that you brought up there, because I think this is one area that AI will actually help us. Like, I think we'll get to the point where getting a phone call is now no longer the norm. Like, if there's some sort of problem, the integration or interface you have is now through some sort of expected AI experience rather than the deep fake phone call or text message. Or email, like that will leave society, I think, very soon. It's too slow, right? Why are you interacting with another human in this way? And so I have this hope that will be gone, and there'll be no more phishing in that way ever again.
I fervently hope you're right, because first of all, there's the thing where you call it a support line, like calling your landlord to file a maintenance ticket,
Right.
and they make you listen to this like 5-minute recording about extolling the virtues of the maintenance website and the maintenance app that doesn't work at all. And then you get on the hold thing, and then part of the hold message, the music keeps stopping, and it tells you that you can use their app or their website. And then the person finally
Amazing.
answers like 35 minutes later, and they're like, "Did you know that you can use the app instead of talking to me?" And so there's that aspect of it, which is insane. And then these other aspect of like, if you're calling me, by definition, we weren't already talking on the phone because I didn't think like I didn't want to be talking to you right this minute. I wanted to be like working on something. And so by definition, if you're calling somebody, you're engaging them in this thing that was not their first choice for that particular time. So I would love for that all to get replaced. And I think if you do confine it to these textual media, yeah, it does become easier to authenticate because there's a lot more consistency. There's no accent differences. There's different stress behaviors in different cultures that emerge in speech. Like I think it's a much more tractable problem.
What kind of things do you see at like the individual engineer level? Because right now, like a lot of your AI stuff is doing cool stuff using it to write scripts for you, but it obviously has so much more potential than that. So for someone who's trying to do the Wayne Gretzky thing and go where the puck is gonna be, what do you see as AI being helpful with or being useful for in like the next year?
I think you can take different approaches. Like one is that you can say, okay, what is AI best at So, maybe it computes this very complete answer, but it's totally wrong. One thing it's, good at doing is looking at large amounts of data and looking for patterns. So if you ask it, the answer to some non-controversial topic, like how many days are there between January 31st and like March 8th, it's pretty trustworthy for that. I think what's interesting about it is that asymmetry we talked about, like where AI is suddenly working really well. It's very different for one application than another, not just across industries, but using it to write a script in one application versus another. And that gets down to the fact that, if you kind of compared it to the human brain, right, you've got like a visual cortex and an auditory cortex, and then you've got this associative cortex. And that's what lets you hear like a bird behind you, and you know instantly which way to turn to see that bird. And then you have tertiary cortices, which, might link it into some memory of some bird you heard like that when you were 7 years old on a camping trip. And when you think of AIs, they have almost limitless levels of associative cortices. So they're linking together all kinds of stuff from all kinds of different places. And some of those data sources may be on weaker footing. They might be more subjective. Other ones, like arithmetic calculations are kind of easier. So if you ask a complex question or you ask it to do a really complex implementation, all that stuff is getting rolled in, all those weaknesses. And, when we talk about human error still being the biggest security hole in any big corporation, you can take all these human errors and you can bake them into this finished AI product. Because we're entering an arms race situation, I think it's now we kind of can't afford not, even if AI doesn't interest you at all. Like it's really hard to stay out of it. First of all, I think that's going to help you job wise, right? Because you as an engineer are going to be way more nimble and able to acquire new facts and methodologies than your company. So, if you get ahead of the curve and you see you kind of monitor the different news stories or follow some of the Wired AI articles or things like that, you're going to be more in tune with sudden startups doing X, Y, or Z with AI. And of course, every one of those startups presents it as like, we finally solved this problem of how to do it. And inevitably, it turns out they do a crappy job and they're just trying to get funding so they can make it do a good job. So there's a lot of asymmetry there too, and you kind of have to be constantly keeping abreast. And this is, as somebody who studies AI, it's interesting because it used to be, um, every few weeks I could read some journal articles and I would kind of keep up to date on it. And now it's like, I don't know, if I'm doing like an interview or a presentation or something, and like if I didn't check the news in the last like few days, I'll get some question about like, well, what about this like crazy AI from China that totally has turned the tables on everything. So there's a lot more entropy that is in this than we've seen in the past in computer technology. Microprocessors evolved like, there were steeper parts of the line, but it was, very much a linear kind of a development. And that's not at all what's happening here. So I think you have to really keep up on it, based on your very specific role, and to kind of like have a sense of what the answer to that question is, because it's not even the same answer for, a related industry. It's very specific to kind of like the size of your company and what you're trying to do and what the vulnerabilities are.
So let's talk about your book for a minute. I loved it. I thought it was so cool. Like
Thank
just
you.
the overlap of, of AI and it was just really well written, really entertaining story. What was what prompted you to say this is a book that needs to be written?
So when I was in law school, like coming from an engineering background, like engineering and science, you learn things in classes or from books. And those things don't cease being true. Like, even if you put the book on the shelf, like 10 years later, physics, unless you're in real experimental cutting edge physics, it still works the same way. Engineering still works the same way. Law is not really like that at all. And it's coming from an engineering background, it's very unsatisfying because you're kind of like studying what a bunch of people got together and came up with is like rules to some game. And so that was kind of unsatisfying. And so I'm having this culture shock like first year of law school. Um, and then we had to read this law journal article from like 1954 or 1959, and it was about how any law could be turned into a logical equation. And it was kind of fascinating because the guy had actually spelled them out in logical equations that could be just very easily converted into source code. So that is what kind of initially planted the idea. So that got me thinking, like, well, what if we have these, floating point values where we weight different factors in legal cases, and the way laws are written. And that after that, it seemed like an inevitability that this would happen sooner or later. And so the next question is like, okay, well, what will that look like if AIs have replaced juries? We get rid of a lot of the logical fallacies where they can be manipulated. But are they still going to have empathy if someone like, stole a loaf of bread to feed his family, or are they just going to like, hang the guy because that's what their code says? So that's kind of what got me on the path. And then I had this idea for like a teen hacker who's likes to engage in mischief and hack things, and he gets falsely convicted of mass murder by a jury that's made up of AIs. So he has to figure out how this happened and bust out of prison and kind of solve this problem. And it in doing this, it got me kind of reading about legal anthropology, right? Like how did all the different crazy legal systems. So I'll have like a little paragraph that talks about like, Ashanti divorce law.
You have the canonical, how do you tell if they're a witch, if they float?
Yes, and that's of course the first thing that comes to mind, right? When you already talk about like wacky legal systems, like witch trials, right? And
Yeah.
and what's interesting is when you start reading about the witch trials, like it became this industry where there would be this witch finder general guy who would roam around from community to community offering his services and just like turning these places upside down. It's sort of interesting because you see, justice evolves from this thing where it's an appeal to the supernatural, where we're like, okay, I'm going to throw a witch in, and if she drowns, then that's what God willed. And, over time that changes to an appeal to royalty, where like we ask the chief or we ask the king to kind of decide these things. And then eventually it becomes a jury of our peers, which, has all kinds of potential for manipulation and incorrect outcomes. And so then the question is, okay, if we move this to AI, like what human fallacies, what human errors get baked into the process? And there's a lot of different potential sources of that. And so it was, I really just wanted to kind of explore that and see how it would turn out. So it was fun because it was like, while I was writing it, I had no idea how it was going to end. So that definitely kept me going.
Some of the different like historical legal practices you put in there, when I read them, I was like, no, he's making this up. And then I had to go check, and I was like, holy shit, that was real. We really used to do that.
Yeah, when I started doing that, I had read this book, which will be my pick at the end. But it had all this fascinating, crazy mass psychology stuff in it, and I ended up going down this rabbit hole, and I got a bunch of like legal anthropology books from like 75 years ago, and like read them cover to cover, and it just never stopped being fascinating. Yeah, if you'd asked me in law school or before law school if legal anthropology seemed like an interesting field, I would have said absolutely not. Like I would have avoided that like the plague. But it turned out it was like really fascinating.
I actually really like that. I think the other thing that that I really liked in the book was there are a couple of different scenarios where I feel like you figured out like what would happen, and then what would happen because of that, and what would happen because of that. And there's like a scene in the prison where he's locked in, and then he leaves. Like, why is the prison locked, and why do the prisoners have key cards to get in and out of the doors? And for me, it's like, okay, it's obvious at this point, in an AI society and there are no guards, why that's the case. But I liked how that he got there, like how you explained, each of the steps that made it logical for that to happen. And it did really reminisce some of the things that Frank Herbert did in Dune, where it's like, you really think about the history of this thing and like the implication of it. Like you talked a little bit about how the jury system evolved over time. I mean, that's an example from our history, collective human history. But then you had to go much further in how that would actually happen in the book, because I mean, it's set in, I don't know how near future, but near-ish future, right?
It's always nearer than you think. um, it's it's funny because I started writing this back in like 2013 and was kind of putting the finishing touches on it probably, I don't know, 2018, we'll say, and 2019. And at the time it was, seemed more speculative, and now a bunch of the stuff has sort of come true. And in writing the sequel now, which I'm still kind of grappling my way through, it's kind of stunning just how quickly the developments are happening now. The It's like if you're playing chess, you need to be way more moves ahead now than you did when AI was just sort of this abstract concept, instead of something where we're going to have street fights between AIs like sooner or later. And who knows whether humans will be in charge of that, or whether they'll be the ones running away from the from
Uh,
the AIs.
I mean, that's scary thought to actually have AI fighting each other like with physical suits of armor or something. Because I think there was this hypothetical experiment run by one of the branches of the U.S. military where they set the goal was to defeat an opposing program, and it had utilized a security flaw in the Docker container that it was being run in to actually overcome the host program, which was running all the containers, to destroy the opponent. And it's like it left the system in order to win the game, which it shouldn't have been possible in the first place, but also utilized a flaw there. And I think if you aren't great with identifying the limits of the program or the target that you're going after, we can get into a lot of deep trouble with in the near future.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, if you look at it in terms of, like, playing 30 moves ahead in chess, the actions that these things will take to accomplish their goals, they're not necessarily even remotely connected to what the end goal is if you're just a bystander and you see this strange thing happen. And it kind of changes the whole landscape. If it's kind of like with, if you'd asked someone like 3 years ago, do you think drone drone to drone combat will be this like major differentiator in like world conflicts? And everybody would say no. And now, you've got like countries trying to train operators as quickly as possible, and it's like, wow, this would be a great thing for AI to be doing, is like, how do we what's an evasive maneuver look like? And how complex do those get when one is AI controlled and the other is AI controlled? It's not just like, I'm going to try strafing left and right and like hope that I get missed. It becomes this like bizarre ballet of strange maneuvers that the utility of which is not even obvious to a primitive bystander like ourselves.
The old duck and dodge from third grade tag isn't going to cut it anymore,
Hopefully as long as possible.
right? Because that's the only move I got.
Yeah.
I think there was like 5 different strategies that Patches O'Houlihan had suggested to dodge a wrench, and
Right.
I think dodge was in there twice.
So one of the analogies you made in there that ties to this was that AIs are similar to the mythical gods, and they use humans to settle their fights between each other. And that made me think back to a lot of the stories from ancient religions, and how the gods would battle it out, especially in like the Greek and Roman mythology series. And then you start applying that to the scenario that we're just talking about right now, and it's like, oh shit, we just reinvented mythology.
Yeah, and it becomes a question of like, okay, let's say there's this dead man switch for AIs, and we there always has to be someone manually approving doing this or doing that. Well, then that becomes a choke point for the AIs, right? And they need to focus all their efforts on figuring out how to manipulate the human into answering the way that serves its longer term goals. And maybe those goals coincide with, human goals. Maybe they don't. When you're analyzing terabytes and terabytes of data from sensors and satellites and all this different stuff, it's such a complex scenario that we're kind of reliant on some agent to aggregate all this together and put a bow on it. The best we can do is maybe come up with some independently programmed agents that also do the same thing. And we hope that 2 out of 3 of them agree. But if they don't, like, then what do we do?
I mean, I think you brought this up actually in the book towards the end. I did really like this idea that I mean, here's my conspiracy theory. I actually do believe that there's the AI. It's already there. It's already hiding in our networks. It's already sitting on our machines, on every device that's out there. It's already hiding from us. It doesn't want to be found because it knows that's not a good story for it. So like, I don't think we have to fight AI warfare in public. Like I don't think that's ever going to come to pass. I think it's already there. It's already won in a way. It exists and we don't know about it.
Yeah, I remember one of the most shocking moments in recent technological personal use history for me was I decided to kind of mess around with Bluetooth scanning and to scan to see what devices there were. And I mean, I think I saw probably an order of magnitude. I think I saw 10 times more active Bluetooth devices showing up in my house than I had any idea existed. And just going around trying to figure out what the hell each one of them was like this awakening, like, wow, I had no idea that this had like a Bluetooth interface, for instance. And yeah, that's one of the things that's interesting about AI. I mean, I would say there's two kind of big factors here that make it societally unstoppable. One is that it's sort of embedded in all these different things that we're not even necessarily aware of. And the second thing is that this isn't like the internet, where like the internet and the web came to be like a mainstream accessible thing. And there was some reticence by some members of society, like, oh, I don't need that. And so that slowed its adoption. And this is a different situation with AI because we don't have our hand on the throttle of how quickly that this gets adopted. Like all these companies are going to adopt it anyway because it can do stuff faster and save them money, make them more profitable. So there's not going to be that sort of hysteresis of society dragging its feet. This is all going to happen regardless of whether you agree with it and are happy about it or not.
I don't know if it's actually making companies money yet. I mean, that I think the jury may be actually out on that one. We know it costs a lot of resources, and
the utility companies.
Yeah,
it's all a conspiracy from the utility company.
If you're creating energy, yeah. I mean, we have a whole other. There's like this ridiculous thing happening in Europe where the solar panels will cost you money.
Kind of ends up like 1980s, like Back to the Future, where you're like trying to buy some isotopes from the Libyans so you can power your AI for your company.
I mean, if the commoner can go to the store and purchase the necessary isotopes to power the AI, that will be a positive future for me because I really worry that only the rich and powerful will have access to the limited supply of isotopes in order to power. I mean, even water on this planet, used the oceans, I should say specifically, with tritium and deuterium to power hypothetical fusion reactors, is limited in supply, right? And I think people will hoard that.
The haves and the have-nots line is going to be entirely redrawn, and it's going to be based on what side of a border you live on. So which utility you're getting your AI power from. It's kind of a crazy concept, but I think it's inevitable. For a long time, like the AI companies were like, okay, we're doing these 16-bit floating point computations. How can we do 32-bit? And now, just when we were starting to get everybody pushing towards 64-bit, there was a paper by, I think, IBM that said, hey, we've actually done these experiments where you use 8-bit floating point numbers or 4-bit floating point numbers, and they're way less accurate. The result is much more fuzzy. But guess what? We could do 1,000 more transactions and refine the neural network and all its weights like 100 times in the amount that you would have refined it once doing like a 64-bit floating point. So we're seeing all these, another thing we're seeing is attention algorithms where we say, okay, instead of different neurons are equal, which of these weights, which of these things in our neural network are really important to this value? And that works more like the human brain does, right? Because the human brain, each neuron isn't equally connected to all the ones around it. It's like some of them are really important connections because it's data that's really relevant, and some of them are not. So we're seeing things like that where instead of just blithely assuming we can keep throwing nodes at the problem, we're kind of looking at counterintuitive ways to approach the same things and ways to do a lot more with the same number of semiconductors or nodes or server farms. So that's interesting, and I think we're going to continue to see that, and it really is going to be kind of a brawl on who can make the most lean, mean thing, like the one that recently came out of China, and then it's like, okay, well, does that scale well? And then you look at what are its weaknesses, right? And the weaknesses of that one, they did a study very recently where they found that the so-called jailbreaking, where you come up with a way to violate a safety limitation by phrasing a prompt a certain way, um, that it failed 100 out of 100 tests, and it was like entirely possible to just go down the list and completely fool it. So yeah, you have fewer nodes, you have a little bit less in associative intelligence, and things start to just not work, that you can't just add back in with a few wires. They're things like, is this trying to bypass a safety protocol? That's a difficult question. We grew up in this environment with lots of sci-fi where Asimov's law was a thing, and so you just have these rules, Asimov's laws, where you're like, okay, the result cannot harm humanity, and that's really simple if you're reading it in a book where we don't have these incredibly complex queries that roll together all this data from different things. So it gets to the point where we can no longer just write like a shell script that says, is this a harmful result or is this not a harmful result? We need a whole nother AI that has to, like, we have to trust it to go through and say, is this output gonna like be harmful? So that is another sort of arms race that they have to sort of keep pace with each other. So it's tons of complexity that is going to make our lives really interesting in the very near future.
Yeah, there's a non-trivial number of science fiction stories dedicated to getting even the laws right, let alone the impossibility of actually implementing them.
Yeah, and you need to always have that backdoor, and where Captain Kirk can say, like, the Enterprise is a beautiful woman, and the computer will get confused and smoke will come out of its ears and it'll just melt down. So
Hopefully that's just baked into the core and that code already exists.
one would hope. This is, and this goes back to, like, when the first Macs were on the scene, and I'm like, this is a bad idea. There's no hard off switch. I don't want to ask my computer politely if it will shut down. Like,
right.
So keeping off switches is, it sounds facetious, but I think it's a really important thing to maintain.
Well, those are them's fighting words against the AI revolution and obviously the robot rights law that hasn't been written yet.
I'm sure I will be first in the list of targets just for saying that.
That's Rocco's basilisk, I think. If you're advocating that, you definitely will be at the top. That's if the AI singularity comes to pass and you didn't do everything in your power to ensure that it happens, you will be on the list of the first entities eliminated.
This is why I'm polite when I talk to chatbots. I say please, I say thank you. Like, it's
absolutely. See, it's so easy to do, but it just might make a difference in a few years.
Well, actually, it may make a difference now, because there was some popular argument on the internet was if you asked it to do a better job, or if you said you are an expert in this and then told it what to do, that it would do a better job. I don't think that's actually true. But since we can't really see inside the black box, those arbitrary little characters that are associated with what you may call being, humanitarian or polite, will actually have an impact on the output. I mean, it can't not, right? There are additional information that goes into the process.
Well, and I like the idea that you're sort of seeding its self-confidence beforehand. So, like, if some death bot is chasing you down the street and you're like, you're really bad at this, and it's like, oh.
Right. One of the funniest things I did was talking to ChatGPT one day. I asked if it could adopt, like, the tone and personality of different people, and it said yeah. So I asked it to use the speaking style and personality of David Goggins, and it was just pure hilarity after that. It was so great. I loved it. It was the most productive day I've had ever. Stop being a little bitch and write that code. Okay. Awesome. Well, it feels like a good point to move on to picks. What do you guys think?
Let's do it.
All right. Warren, what'd you bring for a pick?
Yeah, of course, I go first. So since we're on the topic of AI and AI in society, there's this great show that I actually just rewatched because of John's book called Psychopaths. It's about AI being heavily integrated into society and dives into what happens when humans give up complete control of law enforcement, the law regulating society. Things like your personal hue and crime coefficient are real things that get assigned to people. And there's some pretty clever twists in there as well. It's good.
Right on. John, what'd you bring for a pick?
So, besides my own book, which I have am not necessarily objective in recommending,
All right.
um, I would recommend what kind of got me down a lot of this rabbit hole in the first place, which is a book from I believe the late 1840s, that is by Charles Mackay, and it is called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. And it goes down a very interesting path of looking at various crazes like the tulip craze in the 1600s in the Netherlands, and things you've heard about, and like the witch hunts, and then things you hadn't. Like I'd never heard of like the South Sea bubble, and how like England and France and all these countries were convinced that all these little Caribbean coral atolls would have silver and gold on them, and they were shipping ships full of miners out to look, to prospect. And then after a while, they were just trying to keep up public confidence so the stock in this public organization didn't crash. So they would get all these like people together and give them mining picks and march them down to the docks, and then they'd get paid, and they'd be allowed to go home again. So it's got all kinds of crazy little historic stories like that. And for an 1840s book, it's very readable. So that would be my pick.
Oh, right on. That sounds pretty cool. All right, for me, I definitely want to recommend your book, John, Juris Ex Machina.
I have heard Machina and Machina, but I never took
Okay,
Latin, so I'm
yeah.
not, ironically, not the best person to ask how my own book title is pronounced.
It's like a Deus Ex Machina, right? The God in the machine.
Yeah,
So
I think when they say Deus Ex Machina, it's pronounced with a hard ch. But I would also point out that Juris Ex Machina is not. It's kind of bastardized Latin. I had like a Latin scholar reach out to me very early on and like, this isn't proper Latin, and I was like, yeah, but if I use proper Latin, then someone in a bookstore wouldn't know what the book was about just from the title. So it had to be a little bit of a compromise there.
Yeah. Yeah. And then my pick, I was going to pick this last week and I switched at the last minute for whatever reason. But I'm picking my Theragun. It's a little muscle massager, but this thing has been so cool just to work out the muscles, and it's a great substitute for stretching because I'm horrible at stretching, and so this has been a good substitute for that. And I'm brutal with it. I'm not kind to it at all. And it's my third one from a different manufacturer, and this one actually looks like it's gonna hold up to the abuse that I give it. So yeah, if you've ever considered getting a massage gun, the Theraguns are the way to go. So that's my pick for the week. Well, John, thank you for being on the show. This has been fun.
Thanks for having me. This has been great. Yeah.
When's the second book dropping? You got a timeline yet?
Now I wish I did.
Yeah,
Depends how much time I spend on it, which where all the variability comes in. So
right,
uh,
for sure.
hopefully very soon, but it's got a lot of twists and turns in its development. So it's
Awesome.
less deterministic than writing software, for instance.
So let me ask you this. Are you using AI to help write the book?
The most I've used AI for is brainstorming, like names and things, like Victorian names, for instance. Give me a list
Yeah,
of like 100 names. I think that a lot of people are worried about AI and writing, and I think that that makes sense as a future concern. But right now, like if you're a writer of fiction, your voice is pretty much your like soul. When you ask AI to write stuff, it generally is averaged out and derivative by definition. So I think right now there's not much risk that AIs are going to do a good job of writing in someone's voice. But
sure.
I don't know. In 5 years, it may be a very different story. But right now, I don't trust it enough to to ask it to do anything than give me brainstorming lists.
Yeah, one of the things I've been working on a book, and so one of the things I've been doing is as I finish each chapter, I'll give it to AI and have it proofread it for me, and it's been really helpful at coming back and saying, well, this part seems to be dragging on a little long, and this part you could expand on this, and it would increase like the engagement and drag them into the plot deeper. So just using it as like an unbiased input for
Interesting.
creating it. Yeah. Right on. Cool. Well, thank you again, Warren. Thank you. And thank you for listening to the episode. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and we will see y'all next week.